Last week, I was on Facebook and an old professor of mine had shared a journal they had penned. I think it was designed to probably be an open letter. They penned it, I imagine, probably at least a decade ago. But it was about their opinion on editing and on writing one story in sort of trusting yourself. And so I figured I'd share it here to illustrate a really good point. Now, although this letter was shared on their public Facebook account, I'm not sure if they want this read on YouTube or not, to be honest. So I've kept the personal information of the story redacted. But basically, this is an open letter about her writing a character, basically, that she'd spent many years working on and having to trust herself in the process. I'll pick up about towards the bottom of the first paragraph. Several false starts and changed tenses and rewrites later, it's time to give her away. I don't know about you, but when you've been with a group of characters for so long, you feel awfully responsible for them. You don't want to give them to just anyone. You want them to go to someone who will love them and understand them. You have to trust your editor. But you also have to trust yourself in that you really did all you could to make them ready to hand over. Recently, I was watching a special interview with J.K. Rowling that came with Harry Potter 6 DVD my son got for Christmas. I really love that interview because it shows J.K. Rowling being herself. It shows her being insecure and overwhelmed and grateful. And after we watched together, I told my husband how much I loved the part when Rowling said that at a certain point, she has to let go of everyone else involved and trust herself to get the story right. Later, he told me I misinterpreted the section, and that's not what he was saying at all, but I choose to remember it my way. I thought a lot about the idea of trusting yourself, misinterpreted or not. It reminds me of the brilliant advice Jennifer Richard Jacobson gave a group of us years ago to ask of your manuscript, is it ready yet? And I think these things go together. There are certain questions only you can ask and answer when it comes to your work. At some point, you can't ask your beloved critique partners to read another draft, there's just not enough time. And really, at some point, you have to stop relying on everyone else to tell you yes or no, because you're the only one who can really answer that all-important question. Is this true? You, the author, are the only one who can really know. It's such a big question, such a heady question, really. But it comes just before you make the last change, just before you hit send and wish the manuscript well as it goes slipping through the cyberspace to your editor. At some point just before that, there is this brilliant moment. I'll get real sappy and call it the moment of truth. It's this magical moment when it's just you and your characters and their story finally coming full circle. Maybe it's when you read the last sentence of the book for the 99th time and it finally feels like it really is the end. Whatever that moment is, you can feel it. And when you do, you can almost see your characters waving goodbye at last. Even though I'm still having those angsty, what if it actually sucks moments, I also know I'm nearly there. Nearly. Now, the point of this story is that I want to impress upon you that there's no editor that can help you get your story done. And I say that from the perspective of someone who has worked as a freelance editor over the past, 7 years now, something like that. At most, what an editor can do is offer suggestions on how they would perhaps do the story. They can offer perspectives on their experience as far as developmental editing and what usually works as far as the genre, the trope. They can do, obviously, the line and copy editing and all that, the grammar, the punctuations, they can certainly do that. But ultimately, there's no editor that can actually help you get your piece to say what you need it to say. The 2 points that I've really hammered home so far in this vlog have been you as a writer and your clarity, and also the idea that you don't necessarily need to worry to a great extent about your readers. And this philosophy of editing, the idea that an editor really can't help you, ties into that. You as the writer are not responsible for your readers, we'll call it ignorance. You're not responsible basically for what your reader in essence doesn't know. But you as an author are responsible for your clarity. for getting your message or what you are trying to say across as clearly as you can. So there, it's a very yin yang thing. It's a very dualistic thing in that sense, and there's no editor that can say what your story is supposed to say except for you. There were instances, especially when my freelancing was maybe a little bit bigger a couple years ago, where I could tell an author was very new when they reached out to me and I would get their manuscript and they viewed my developmental editing as more of a form of outsourcing. They viewed it as, hey, we have the story down and you'll be the one that'll fix it up and clean it up. It was almost like a form of ghostwriting in a sense. And whenever someone approached it with that mentality, with that attitude, I could tell right away they had not written for a very long time. Your editor is not going to take on the responsibility of getting your story done. This story you're trying to write can only be said by you. Only you can tell the story. I know it's a very kind of cliched thing to say, but it is true. I mentioned before about how every time you put a word down on the page, you're sort of steering the direction of how the story is going to unfold out of a myriad of a million different options. It's the same thing when your story is told. Only you can steer that story the way that it needs to be steered. The moment someone else does, it's no longer your story. It becomes theirs, just with your general idea. So there's no editor that's ever going to fix it for you. There's no one that's ever going to push, to take the, your story basically and push it to, from some mediocre thing to some grand tale. Practically speaking, I think an editor basically can give you a +1. Like it's almost like a video game where if you have like 3 lives and you get like a little power up basically and it gives you an extra life. That's basically what an editor can do. If you view it like as a scale of like 1 to 10, say your story's at like a 7, yeah, an editor can offer suggestions perhaps that can maybe get your story to maybe an 8, right? It can bump it up maybe 1 level, but I feel ultimately it's still going to be your story and it's still your responsibility. And you need to trust yourself instead. You need to get your skill up to a certain level that you don't need to worry about an editor. I would still advise hiring one and using one as, using a freelance one before you query or before you self-publish. But again, the story is going to ultimately fall on you at the end of the day, and it needs to say what you need it to say. And if what I've said here maybe is a bit disheartening, the thought of you having to do everything yourself and not relying on an editor, to be frank, that's why you became a writer, right? Like the idea that you can get a story completely written and polished and have your words say exactly what they said and have you be the one who wrote the whole thing. I mean, that's why we became writers. It's the idea of coming up with something and hoping someone else can kind of save your story. It's like, why did you become a writer then? Like the story should say exactly what you want it to say. Every little bit of it, basically. I mean, should be. It's amazing to me that writing is one of the few activities that you have complete control over this project. You don't need to have a team. You don't have to have anyone else. It can literally just be you controlling every single aspect of it. And maybe I'm just some type A control freak, but that to me is the joy of writing in many respects. It's the fact that I don't have to collaborate with anyone. I can literally do all of it myself. And it's an art form where it's encouraged that you do it yourself. And I suppose to speak just a bit more broadly and to give a bit more of a broad perspective, I mean, can you imagine really any other art form requiring an editor? Like, can you imagine, Michelangelo basically needing to hire an editor basically before painting the Sistine Chapel, right? Can you imagine someone going in there basically and making corrections for him, and him going, yeah, I drafted kind of a rough sketch of what I want up on the ceiling here. Can you go and can you kind of fill it in for me? You got some ideas on filling it in. Can you imagine? Again, I'll go back to like Van Gogh. Can you imagine Van Gogh requiring like someone to take a look at his paintings and to finish his paintings for him, or Mozart relying upon someone to finish one of his pieces there. Writing just seems like one of the few art forms where people are willing to surrender what they are trying to create to someone else, just out of a sense of, I won't say laziness, but out of a sense that someone else knows better than you, that someone else can say your work, or do your work better than you can. So I hope that helps. I hope that that sort of gives you a sense of empowerment that, you are the one that can say your story. I hope it gives you this, obviously I hope it impresses upon you the responsibility of being a writer, but I also do hope as well that this gives you a sort of sense of empowerment in hearing that, and in knowing that, hey, this is your baby through and through. This is your thing completely. I think I'll probably do another video at some point on thoughts on editing, and when to hire an editor and things like that to look for. But for now, I think a video like this one sort of reminding you that an editor's not really going to be your lifeboat in any grand sense can be very, very helpful. And I think this will go a lot further than a video on choosing editors, or what to look for when hiring one.